The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Elena Martinez pushed through the staff entrance at 11:16 p.m., her badge already clipped to the waistband of her scrubs. No fanfare, no greeting, just the soft click of it catching the edge of the doorframe as she passed. The smell hit her first, the familiar assault, stainless steel antiseptic mixed with the ghost of yesterday's coffee and something underneath that never quite washed out, the faint copper memory of blood that didn't belong to anyone alive anymore. She moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial like she was apologizing for taking up space, shoulders slightly forward, eyes on the worn linoleum that had been buffed to a shine by people who would never be thanked for it. The night shift nurses' station sat quiet at this hour, the fluorescent wash turning everyone's skin the color of hospital walls. 3 RNs glanced up as she arrived, their eyes sliding past her without catching, that particular talent people develop when they've decided someone doesn't warrant recognition. Elena didn't expect different. She'd earned their silence over 6 months of being careful, competent, and completely invisible. She set her bag in her assigned locker, the one at the far end, and pulled on the latex gloves that never quite fit right because her hands had been made by something other than a glove factory. The scars on her hands told stories she'd learned not to tell. Shrapnel from a VBIED in 2009 had left a constellation of small white marks across her left palm, the kind that didn't show up unless you were looking. The calluses on the heel of her right hand came from something else, 17 years of holding lives together before her body decided it was done with remembering how. Her hands had been steady then. Surgical steady. The kind of steady that came from muscle memory that ran deeper than thought. In Marjah, in 2010, she'd pulled 17 soldiers from the wreckage of a collapsed compound while her own blood pooled inside her abdomen. 2 had died anyway. 15 had gone home. She'd come home too, but the coming home part had taken longer than the bleeding out part, and somewhere in the middle of that journey, her hand started shaking so badly she couldn't load her own sidearm without dropping it twice. Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez had hung her dress uniform in the back of her closet, put her Navy Cross in a box she didn't open, and disappeared into Denver like a person walking backward out of her own life. No one at Oak Creek Memorial knew. No one needed to. She was just Elena, the quiet night nurse with the steady hands who never asked for recognition and never made waves. That's what she'd wanted, to be unremarkable. To be forgotten. To be someone the world had never asked to save anyone ever again. She'd almost made it. The 11 to 7 shift unfolded like it always did. Vitals, charting, the soft beeping of monitors that never stopped, the way time moved differently at night, either impossibly fast or frozen in amber, no in between. Elena moved from room to room with the kind of efficiency that looked like routine from the outside, though it was something else entirely. In room for 12, she caught something no one else noticed, a patient's respiratory pattern shifting one breath too shallow, the kind of change that meant something about the medications the attending ordered didn't match what the body was telling her. She made a note. She said nothing. The attending was a board member's nephew. The patient's family was from money. Those equations had a syntax Elena had learned to read, and her role in them was silence. Around 1:34 a.m., Congressman Holloway and his wife had arrived in room for 18. Their daughter had fallen skiing in Vail, nothing catastrophic but complicated enough to merit the ER and a consulting physician. Dr. Hargrove arrived 20 minutes later with a weight of his own importance preceding him like a pressure wave. He moved through the hospital the way high-status people always did, as though the space itself had been arranged for his passage. His suit cost more than Elena's car. His posture said he'd never apologized for anything in his life. He stood at the patient's bedside, the Holloways flanking him like apostles, and he ordered a medication protocol that made Elena's shoulders tighten the way they used to tighten before an IED-laden convoy entered a valley with only one way out. She waited until he was writing the order in the chart, his expensive fountain pen moving across the screen with theatrical precision. Then she stepped forward, her voice calibrated to barely exist. "Doctor, the patient's renal function cleared this morning. That dose might cause accumulation." The room contracted. Hargrove's eyes moved to her like she'd appeared on a surface he'd been using to see his own reflection. "You're the night nurse." "Yes, doctor." "You're reading renal panels now?" The results came in at midnight. I thought you might want. What I want is for you to monitor vitals and leave the medicine to people who went to medical school. He turned back to the Halloways with the ease of someone who knew his authority was unquestionable. Some staff members forget their scope of practice. It's not a concern here. Congressman Holloway laughed, the kind of laugh that closed doors for people. His wife looked away from Elena with the efficiency of someone who'd already decided she was beneath witnessing. Elena felt the moment settle around her like something had been decided that she wasn't present to object to. She nodded once, said, "Of course, doctor," and left the room the way you leave a place where you've been told, very specifically and in front of witnesses, that you didn't belong. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part came 5 days later. Elena sat in the break room at 2:22 a.m., a container of lukewarm pasta in her hands, when 3 nurses came in laughing about something that happened on the day shift. She recognized them. They rotated through night nursing, people she'd worked alongside, people who made small talk in the supply closet and complained about attending physicians while loading medication carts. They saw her and stopped moving. It wasn't dramatic. There was no gasp or visible shift. Their bodies just made a decision collectively, in that way groups do when they've absorbed a message. One of them set down her half-eaten sandwich. Another left her coffee on the counter. The third, Jessica, who'd once complained about Hargrove for 45 minutes while Elena listened, simply turned around and walked back out the door they just entered. Elena didn't move. She sat with her pasta cooling in her lap and counted her breathing the way they'd taught her to count breathing in therapy, 4 counts in, 6 counts out, the technique supposed to calm a nervous system that had learned to stay alert during circumstances where staying asleep meant dying. The pasta container sat between her hands like an offering no one wanted. A single tear started at the corner of her left eye, the one that had always watered too easily in dry hospital air. She didn't blink it away. She let it move down her cheek and wiped it once, without breaking the line of her gaze toward the doorway, just as Dr. Hargrove passed by outside the break room windows with 2 board members flanking him the way people flank power. When his eyes met hers through the glass, she was still watching. She said quietly, to no one who would hear it, "I've seen what real authority looks like, doctor. This isn't it." But he was already gone, his presence still pushing the air around, and the break room stayed empty. Elena threw away the pasta and went back to work, her hands moving through the remainder of the shift with the kind of precision that required no thought, only muscle memory and the particular discipline of people who'd learned a long time ago that when you stopped being seen, you became invisible. And invisibility, she'd thought at 4:51 a.m. while checking on a stable ICU patient, was supposed to be what she wanted. 2 nights later, everything changed. The next week crystallized everything Elena had learned about invisibility. It was a skill, like intubation or battlefield triage. You perfected it through repetition until it became muscle memory. The congressman's family had arrived at 7:23 p.m. on a Wednesday. Stable patient, routine vitals, nothing that required the kind of intervention that had made Elena contradict Dr. Hargrove's medication order the night before. But the order had been wrong, a 250 milligrams dose of metoprolol for a patient with a documented beta-blocker allergy. She'd said it quietly, deferentially, one hand already reaching for the chart to verify. The family was still in the room. The congressman's brother was visiting, expensive suit, the kind of presence that made some doctors reflexively reach for authority. Hargrove had frozen for exactly 2 seconds. Then his voice dropped into a register Elena recognized, the tone men used when they needed to prove something. "You're a night nurse," he'd said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You follow orders. You don't question treatment decisions." Elena had kept her eyes on the medication vial. The allergy list shows. "Are you a physician?" "No, but..." "Then we're finished here." He'd stepped closer, his shadow falling across the fall line. "I've been practicing medicine for 18 years. You've been pushing pills for what, 5? The congressman's wife had shifted uncomfortably. The brother had already pulled out his phone. "I've seen what real authority looks like," Elena had said afterward, when Hargrove found her alone in the break room, 7 hours into her next shift. She'd been pouring black coffee that tasted like metal and burnt time. He'd followed her there, carrying a manila folder that made his fingers look heavy with purpose. 2 board members had called him, he'd explained. They were very concerned about the medication incident. Very concerned about her judgment. There would need to be a performance improvement plan. Documentation. Weekly evaluations. She'd be on probation for 60 days, and if there were any further incidents, any question about her competence, they would have no choice but to escalate. Elena had set the coffee down with the kind of care usually reserved for explosives. "I've seen what real authority looks like, Doctor. This isn't it." The room had gone silent except for the fluorescent lights overhead, that constant electrical hum that never quite stopped, even at 3 in the morning when the hospital felt like a tomb with a pulse. Hargrove's face had shifted through 3 colors in rapid sequence. Red. Darker red. Then a white that meant something inside him had calcified into certainty. He turned and left without another word, but Elena had known, the way she knew about pressure changes in a landing zone, the way she knew about approaching mortality just by listening to breath sounds, that this was not finished. This was only escalation. The write-up appeared on the unit board at 6:08 a.m., printed in red block letters that seemed to scream. Performance Notice, Elena Martinez. The document was laminated, professionally formatted, posted where every nurse walking the corridor would see it. 3 paragraphs detailing the medication incident, her failure to respect the chain of command, her pattern of questioning physician directives. There was no pattern. There was one incident. But the write-up didn't require accuracy. It required witnesses. They noticed immediately. Sarah from day shift paused while reading the board, her eyes widening just slightly before she looked away. Marcus, who'd been kind to Elena 2 weeks ago, suddenly found urgent work in a different wing. By noon, nurses had mentioned casually that they'd be taking lunch at different times, as if proximity to Elena had become professionally risky. The break room on Thursday night was where Elena discovered the architecture of institutional isolation. She sat at the long table with 2 cups of coffee, one for immediate consumption, one for something to do with her hands, and watched 3 nurses enter the space, see her there, and execute a synchronized retreat so perfect it seemed choreographed. They didn't speak. They just gathered their half-eaten lunches from the refrigerator and left. The door closed with a pneumatic hiss that sounded like something deflating. Elena breathed once. Measured. The kind of breath trained into her during medical school, during combat deployments, during the 6 months after she'd come home broken and decided that vanishing was survival. Hargrove walked past the observation window 30 seconds later. He was speaking quietly into his phone, something about calling the hospital's education coordinator, something about questioning her nursing school references. He paused when he saw her through the glass. His expression shifted into something that looked like satisfaction, the expression of a man who discovered the right frequency to make something break. Elena met his eyes without flinching. She didn't cry. She didn't look away. She allowed exactly one tear to escape, not from sadness, but from the sheer compression of rage that she'd learned to convert into stillness, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact, the way a soldier maintains position under fire. When she spoke, her voice had dropped half an octave. "I've seen what real authority looks like, Doctor. This isn't it." The words came out flat and final, like a closing hatch. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He disappeared from the window, but she could hear him in the hallway, his voice suddenly sharp as he spoke to someone about escalating concerns and safety risks. He was calling in favors now. Elena could feel it the way wounded soldiers could feel storm systems approaching, a pressure change in the institutional atmosphere, a shift in the arrangement of power. She had no idea what was waiting for her 48 hours later. The emergency alarm sounded at 2:13 a.m. on Saturday morning. 3 short pulses that made the whole floor tense like a muscle receiving a shock. Code blue in the trauma bay. ETA for minutes on a military transport, wounded soldier, training accident, something about mechanism unclear but vitals already declining. The ER doors burst open with the kind of violence that happens when people understand the difference between routine and crisis. The stretcher was moving fast, a major in fatigues with oxygen already running and an 4-line that looked like it had been placed in the moving aircraft. The ER nurses scattered into their choreography, cardiac monitoring, blood work, stat labs. Dr. Hargrove was already there, which meant he'd been in the hospital doing something at 2:13 a.m. that had nothing to do with patient care, something that involved important people and institutional power. Elena moved from her station before thought caught up to her body. It was automatic. Muscle memory. 3 tours and 8 years of muscle memory that lived deeper than her civilian identity could reach. The Major's oxygen saturation was already dropping. 94%. 91. The monitor showed tachycardia climbing toward 140 beats per minute. His chest was tight, his breathing shallow, his left side moving differently than his right. Tension pneumothorax. The kind of injury where a puncture to the lung allowed air to accumulate in the chest cavity, collapsing the lung and compressing the heart, essentially suffocating you from the inside while being surrounded by oxygen. Hargrove barked an order for a chest tube. Specific. Confident. Wrong. A chest tube would take 6 minutes, sterile field, local anesthesia, proper positioning. They didn't have 6 minutes. The Major's saturation had dropped to 87. His systolic blood pressure was already falling, 90, then 85. His skin had gone the color of wet ash. Elena was already moving. She'd grabbed the emergency decompression kit, the one that lived in the crash cart for exactly this scenario. 14-gauge needle. She didn't ask permission. She didn't introduce herself. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, located the anatomical landmarks by touch the way she'd done it 17 times before in places that still smelled like diesel and dust and blood that wouldn't wash off even after 6 months of trying. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity filled the room like something alive. O2 saturation climbed. 88, 91. 94, the Major gasped, and his color started changing from ash to something closer to human. His blood pressure ticked up. The monitor's rhythm stabilized. Hargrove stared. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The Major's eyes had found Elena's face. His hand reached out, gripped her wrist with the kind of strength that meant he was still in there, still conscious, still registering what had just happened. Angel 6, he whispered through the oxygen mask. The room went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like something trying to get in. Elena had frozen for 1.3 seconds, enough time for her mind to flash through 7 different operational contexts, enough time to understand that whatever anonymity she'd been building, whatever civilian camouflage she'd wrapped around herself like body armor, had just been identified by someone who'd seen that exact technique performed on the same soldiers in the same operation. But her hands hadn't frozen. Her hands knew what to do. They'd finished the decompression, checked the needle placement, moved him toward the OR with a kind of efficiency that belonged to someone who'd done this in active combat zones with rounds still coming through the walls. As the surgical team rushed past her, Hargrove's expression cycled through confusion toward something darker, not admiration, but something worse. Recognition that he'd been fundamentally wrong about who he'd been attacking, and worse, that his attack had just revealed something he didn't yet understand but understood was important. Elena stepped back into the corridor as they moved the Major toward OR3. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But something inside her that had been carefully compartmentalized for 5 years was beginning to shift, like pressure building behind a dam that had finally started to show cracks. 2 nights after the break room silence, the ER doors hissed open and a Special Forces Major came through them on a stretcher, and everything Elena had spent 5 years building, the anonymity, the quiet, the invisibility, began to collapse in a way she couldn't stop because her hands already knew what her mind was still trying to forget. Training accident, the paramedic said. Low-altitude jump malfunction. The Major's oxygen sat was dropping, 92 when he arrived, 89 at triage, 84 by the time Elena caught the assignment. His breathing had that shallow, desperate quality that meant his lungs were working without any actual purchase, like trying to run in water. She moved toward him the way she always did, measured steps, professional distance, the careful smallness that kept her invisible in a hospital full of people who never looked twice at night shift nurses. But the Major's eyes found her immediately. She exposed his chest for rapid assessment, her fingers moving across the intercostal spaces with the automatic precision of someone who had done this in convoy dust and field tents and the back of transport helicopters. Left side, second and third ribs, the landmarks were the same in Denver as they had been in Helmand Province. The skin was cool, clammy. Decreased breath sounds on the left. Tracheal deviation beginning. Tense pneumothorax building pressure in his thoracic cavity like a loaded pistol. You. The Major's voice cracked through the oxygen mask. Angel 6. I know that technique. The room didn't freeze, but Elena felt it. That moment when the present and past collide and there's nowhere left to run because the past just grabbed your wrist and said your name. She kept her breathing steady. Did not look at him. Oxygen saturation? Kabul. 2011, third group. You pulled Martinez out of the wreckage at checkpoint 12. The Major's breathing was getting worse, each word costing him oxygen he didn't have. I was on overwatch. I watched you move. Saw the rib spread. Nobody does it like that anymore. Field medicine. Real medicine. Not hospital medicine. Elena reached for the crash cart. The ticking of her own heartbeat sounded like boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, and suddenly she was not in Denver anymore. She was in Marjah with rotor wash shaking the desert floor and the smell of diesel and copper and her own adrenaline, and the sounds were different but the pressure was the same, that impossible pressure where minutes turn into seconds and every decision collapses human beings into either breathing or not breathing. The Major's oxygen cascaded, 84. 79, 75. His breathing became paradoxical, the left side not moving at all now, the right side compensating, and she could see the compensation failing in real time. His eyes were starting to show the whites, that look of someone whose body is beginning to understand it's suffocating. A nurse standing 3 feet away reached for the code cart, but Elena's voice cut through before the other woman could touch it. 14-gauge needle decompression, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Get a chest tube kit. Now. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and the entire trajectory of that room shifted like a carrier deck tilting into wind. The residents froze, 3 of them clustered near the monitor, watching oxygen numbers drop like someone reading a countdown timer with no way to slow it. Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway, his mouth already moving with orders that Elena's body had already started executing because muscle memory didn't ask permission and it didn't wait for hierarchy. She gathered the supplies with hands that belonged to someone else, someone trained in the specific geometry of battlefield trauma, someone who had assembled emergency kits in darkness and sandstorms and the kind of adrenaline that made civilian protocol feel like moving through honey. The 14-gauge needle sat between her fingers like it weighed nothing. The anatomical landmarks were burned into her the way other people remember prayer or their mother's voice. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The needle went through skin and into the pressurized void beneath, and the hiss of air escaping. No, she wouldn't think about the sound, wouldn't let that sound pull her backward into other needles and other chests and other desperate minutes. The Major gasped. Oxygen reappeared in his lungs like someone returning air to someone drowning. The monitor shifted, oxygen sat started climbing. 76, 80. 84, 88. 92. Stable. Her hands were steady. The needle was perfect. The pressure released exactly as it should, and the room exhaled with the Major when he took his first breath that actually filled his lungs. She didn't move. Didn't look at anyone. Just kept her hand on the needle because part of her was still in Marjah and part of her was standing here in Denver, and both parts of her understood that the most dangerous moment in any emergency is the moment right after it ends, when adrenaline starts lying to you about what just happened. Get him prepped for a chest tube, she said quietly. Pneumothorax, tension type. He'll need monitoring for at least 6 hours. The residents moved like they'd been released from something. The nurse who'd been about to touch the crash cart was already moving with the stretcher. The room returned to its normal rhythm, beeping monitors, competent voices, the organized chaos of a trauma protocol working exactly as it should. Dr. Hargrove watched from the doorway. His face had shifted, not panic, not relief, but something else entirely. Something that looked like a man watching someone pull back a curtain he'd spent months building to hide behind. Elena could feel his gaze like weight on her shoulders, like crosshairs, like the moment before everything breaks. She turned to leave the trauma bay. The Major's hand reached out, and even through the oxygen mask, she could see him trying to say something, trying to ask the question his eyes already knew the answer to. She met his gaze for exactly 1 second, long enough for him to see that yes, it was really her, and yes, she had just saved his life the same way she'd saved 17 others in a single engagement that had earned medals she kept in a coffee can under her kitchen sink. Then she walked out and clocked out for her break, and as she passed Hargrove in the corridor, he said nothing, but his jaw had tightened into something that looked like a man whose entire plan had just been revealed as insufficient. She needed to think. She needed to call someone. She needed to run. But what she didn't know yet was that the Major was already reaching for his phone, and that in the next 24 hours, institutions were going to move, and protocols were going to be rewritten, and the identity she'd carefully constructed out of anonymity and silence was about to be dismantled by people who didn't accept that anyone, not anyone at all, got to just disappear. The Major's oxygen was dropping. 71. 68. The monitors screamed their digital panic as his lungs collapsed from the inside. Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the chaos, commanding someone to prep the surgical suite, his authority unquestionable, his certainty absolute. The residents froze. Nobody moved. The room filled with the sound of his orders and the terrible silence of a team waiting for someone else to decide. Elena's hands were already moving. She didn't think. Thinking was for people who hadn't spent 3 years in Marjah pulling shrapnel from chests while their own blood soaked into their sleeves. Her hands assembled what she needed from the crash cart, a 14-gauge needle, antiseptic, her muscle memory moving like a second language she'd never forgotten. The hiss of the wrapper echoed in her ears, louder than Hargrove's voice. "What are you doing?" Hargrove turned, his face reddening. "That's not protocol. Step back." Elena was already locating the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. Her fingers found the landmarks the way a musician finds keys in the dark. The needle went in. Firm. Confident. The kind of steady that only comes from hands that have done this while mortars fell and comrades screamed. The hiss of air escaping filled the room like a final breath released. The Major gasped. His color shifted. The monitors climbed. 75. 82. 90. His oxygen was coming back because she had moved, and nobody else had. Sinus rhythm, a resident whispered. The room went dead silent. The Major's eyes found hers, and through the oxygen mask, through the pain, he saw something in the way she held the needle, the economy of her movements, the absence of hesitation. His hand reached for her wrist. His grip was weak but purposeful. Angel 6, he breathed. Marjah. 3rd Special Forces Group. It wasn't a question. Elena pulled her hand back. Wrong person, sir. Her voice was steady. Quiet. The voice of someone whose hands had just saved a life and whose identity had just been fractured in front of 5 medical professionals and 1 attending physician whose entire authority structure had just been dismantled by a night nurse acting without permission. Dr. Hargrove's face had gone pale, then red, then something else. Something that looked like a man watching the ground shift beneath him. He stood at the doorway, hands clenched, watching Elena continue her assessment with the precision of someone who had never been a nurse at all. Within the hour, he made his first call. Board President. Home number. 2 in the morning. We have a serious protocol violation. Scope of practice issue. She acted without physician authorization. His voice was calm, measured, the voice of a man protecting institutional order. By 4 a.m., he had contacted Elena's nursing school references, asking pointed questions about instability and judgment lapses. By 6 a.m., an outside investigator was being arranged to review the incident. By 8 a.m., he had activated something deeper, the network of favors and alliances that had built his career on the backs of people like her. It was systematic. It was competent. It was the response of a man who understood that he couldn't fight her with authority because she had just demonstrated that authority was irrelevant. So he would fight with protocols, with paperwork, with the machinery of institutions. Elena knew what was coming. She sat in her locker room pulling her personal belongings into a cardboard box, a photograph of her late husband, a pair of trauma shears she'd kept for 13 years, the jacket with the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, barely visible to anyone who wasn't looking for it. She had known, the moment her hands moved without permission, that this job was over. You didn't challenge Hargrove in front of a congressman's family and walk away. You didn't save a life he would have let slip away and remain employed. At 6:27 p.m., the HR director appeared with security. "We need your badge," he said, not meeting her eyes. "Your employment is terminated effective immediately. You violated protocol. Acted outside your scope of practice. It's in your best interest not to make this difficult." Elena unpinned her badge and set it on the desk. It made a small plastic sound against the laminate. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply picked up her cardboard box and walked past the nurses' station where 3 colleagues suddenly became very interested in their charts. She drove straight to Riverside Cemetery on Evans Avenue, where the rain had already started, not a soft rain, but the kind that came down in sheets, hammering the pavement like applause nobody wanted. The headstone read her husband's name and the years he had lived, 1978 to 2018. Nothing about how the war had followed him home. Nothing about the 6 months he spent sleeping downstairs because their bedroom felt like a bunker. Nothing about the pills or the silence or the night she came home from a shift and found him in the garage. Elena knelt in the mud. The rain soaked through her jeans. Her fingers traced his name, the letters worn smooth by weather and her own hands, across months and years of visits. "I tried," she whispered. "Like you asked. You said I should disappear. Be normal. Find something quiet where nobody had to know." Her voice broke. She pulled it back together. "I took a job wiping down fours. I kept my head down. I didn't tell anyone. Not the hospital, not the staff, not the one person who might have understood. I was supposed to vanish." She paused. The rain continued its assault, cold against her skin. "But I failed. I couldn't help myself. The moment he crashed, something woke up in my hands that I've been trying to kill for 6 years. And now I can't even hold on to the job that was supposed to hide me. Because I can't stop being what Marjah made me. I can't stop being a soldier, no matter how hard I try to be just a nurse." She stayed there, kneeling in the rain until her legs went numb. Her phone sat in her jacket pocket, silent. She had cleared out her apartment savings account, $2847, which was not enough for a motel, not enough for a rental deposit, not enough for another start. She had applied to 3 more hospitals under the same false references. All 3 had rejected her applications. Word traveled. Hargrove had made sure of it. She reached into her jacket and pulled out the unit patch. It was faded, olive drab, barely visible unless you knew what to look for. The numeral 3 and the word Special Forces Group. She held it in her rain-soaked hands and seriously considered letting it drop into the mud where it could stay buried with everything else. Her eyes burned. But soldiers don't cry. She folded the patch carefully and tucked it back into the jacket lining. And then she heard it. Distant at first. Then closer. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors cutting through the rain, getting louder, the sound moving not toward the hospital but toward the cemetery, toward the small green space where she knelt beside a grave. She stood up slowly, rain streaming down her face, mixing with something else that she refused to acknowledge as tears. Somewhere in the city, in a hospital room, a major who had recognized more than just her technique was making phone calls. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., people with authority were listening. She had no idea what was about to walk through those doors, or rather, descend from the sky above. 24 hours after security escorted Elena from Oak Creek Memorial, after the rain stopped and her apartment fell silent, her phone rang at 2:38 in the morning. Unknown number. DC area code. She almost didn't answer. The voice on the other end was calm, methodical, the kind of voice that didn't waste words. Is this Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez? The one with the Navy Cross. She didn't breathe. Who is this? The line held steady. Someone who has a major in recovery at Denver Presbyterian who can't stop talking about a combat medic named Angel 6. Someone whose brother served 3rd Special Forces Group in Marjah. Someone who wants to know why the medic who saved his CO isn't working anymore. Elena set the phone down. Picked it up again. Where are you calling from? The voice didn't answer the question directly. We're coming to Denver. Don't go anywhere. The major had recognized more than her technique when she exposed his chest for assessment. He'd seen the faded patch sewn inside the lining of the jacket she'd draped over him for warmth, 3rd Special Forces Group, Marjah, 2009. His brother had worn the same colors. Had come home talking about a medic who pulled 17 soldiers from a bombed-out compound while bleeding from shrapnel wounds herself. Angel 6. The name had lived in the major's memory for 12 years. When his lungs filled and Elena's hands moved with that unmistakable battlefield precision, when she assembled the needle decompression with scraps of equipment most nurses wouldn't recognize as a kit, his oxygen-starved brain made the connection that his conscious mind couldn't quite form. Angel 6, he'd whispered through the pain. She'd frozen for exactly 1 second. That second had told him everything. By 11 a.m. the next day, a Navy lieutenant in dress whites walked into the hospital administrator's office at Oak Creek Memorial. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stated her rank and her purpose. I'm here regarding the termination of Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, Navy Reserve. You fired a decorated combat medic. The administrator started to speak. The lieutenant opened a file. 17 lives extracted from a collapsed structure in Marjah under enemy fire. Bronze Star. Silver Star. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross, which means she was wounded while treating casualties. Your hospital just terminated her because your ER director couldn't handle being told no. The room went still. A nurse administrator, hands trembling, reached for the file and began reading, actually reading, the documentation that had been in Elena's personnel folder the entire time. Names. Dates. Casualty counts. Surgeries performed in field conditions. The file was 43 pages long. Nobody had ever opened it. Then the SEAL team leader arrived, and the room changed temperature. He was smaller than anyone expected, which somehow made his presence worse. His name tag read Graves. He didn't sit down. I trained with Elena Martinez in 2006, he said, looking directly at the administrator. She outranked everyone in my squad. Bronze Star for that Marjah op, Silver Star from a different deployment she hasn't talked about in about 6 years because talking about it gives her nightmares she'll never admit to anyone. 2 Purple Hearts, meaning she went back in twice after being wounded. And a Navy Cross, which means... He paused. Looked at the lieutenant. Which means the rest of you have no idea who you just fired. He opened his own folder. Not paperwork. Photographs. Elena in desert camouflage, blood on her gloves, carrying a wounded soldier. Elena in the same fatigues, arm wrapped in field dressing, still working. Elena at a ceremony, standing at rigid attention while someone placed a medal around her neck. This is who you terminated. This is who was worth nothing to your director. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Hargrove. The worst part came when the hospital's IT specialist, a former Marine named Clayton who'd been quietly working in the basement server room for 7 years, walked in carrying a laptop. He was thin, scarred down one arm, the kind of person nobody noticed. He opened the laptop. I keep backups of everything, he said, voice steady as a metronome. Mandatory system administration. That means I have every frame of security footage from the trauma bay on the night the Major came in. I also have the footage from outside Dr. Hargrove's office from 6:17 a.m. this morning, when he accessed the incident camera files and attempted a full deletion sequence. The screen showed Hargrove at his desk, hands moving frantically, sweat visible on his forehead. The deletion bar crawled across the screen. 80%. 90%. But it never finished. I secured all files at 6:19 a.m., Clayton said. I've already forwarded them to the State Medical Board, along with my official report that the deletion was evidence tampering related to patient endangerment. I've also contacted federal law enforcement because a SEAL team major is the son of a congressman, which means this is now their jurisdiction, not just Colorado's. He closed the laptop. Have a nice day, Doctor. The hastily assembled board meeting happened in Conference Room 3, the one with the long oak table where hiring decisions got made. Elena wasn't there. She didn't need to be. The SEAL team leader sat at the head of the table. The Navy lieutenant sat beside him. The hospital's board president sat at the other end, face draining from pink to white as Clayton's footage played on the screen. Hargrove entered last, thinking it was still his hospital, his domain, his world where people deferred to his title and his connections. He saw the faces. He saw the footage. He saw the SEAL team leader watching him with an expression that suggested he'd seen worse things, done worse things, and was currently trying to decide if this particular moment warranted his attention. Dr. Hargrove, the lieutenant said, "You're being relieved of clinical privileges effective immediately pending investigation by the Colorado Medical Board. Your termination of Elena Martinez is being voided, and a formal apology is being issued in writing." Hargrove's mouth opened. No words came out. He looked like a man watching the ground open beneath him. "You can't," he started. "We can," the SEAL leader interrupted, voice like an engine that didn't need to run at full throttle to be terrifying. "We absolutely can. Sit down." Hargrove Saturday. The silence that followed lasted exactly 43 seconds. Nobody broke it. Not until the board president's voice came through, hollow and final, "You're finished here." 6 months later, Elena sat in her new office at the VA hospital's trauma center, looking out at Denver's skyline through a window that didn't face the highway anymore. The office was smaller than she'd imagined it would be, but that was the point. Director of Veteran Care Services. The title meant something, but not in the way titles usually did. It meant she got to rebuild the system that had burned people like her. It meant she got to train nurses and doctors on trauma responses in people who'd seen things that changed their neurology. It meant 17 other combat medics would get jobs this month instead of disappearing into civilian life like ghosts. And it meant her phone never rang with bad news about good people getting fired for knowing too much. She was reviewing a training curriculum when she looked out the window. Across the street, in the strip mall parking lot between a tax preparation service and a tanning salon, there was a folding table set up under the afternoon sun. A banner hung from the table, plastic letters spelling Hargrove Insurance. And sitting behind that table, alone, watching the VA hospital entrance with an expression that cycled between anger and disbelief, was Dr. Hargrove. His medical license had been revoked by Colorado, then flagged in 4 other states. His board connections had evaporated the moment his attempted evidence deletion became public record. The congressman's daughter, the SEAL team leader's niece, had written an op-ed about institutional protection of bad actors in healthcare. 3 major networks picked it up. His name was attached to words like predatory and dangerous and deliberately negligent. Now he sold health insurance from a folding table and flinched when anyone called him doctor. Elena watched him for a long moment. She didn't smile. She didn't feel satisfaction. She just noted the fact of his existence in the way she noted any piece of evidence that the world had corrected itself, however imperfectly. Then she turned back to her curriculum. There was work to do. That same afternoon, a young Marine came into the clinic, 22 years old, hands shaking, eyes that had seen Kandahar 3 months ago. Elena didn't introduce herself by title. She just sat down beside him and said, "Talk to me." And he did, because he recognized something in her posture, in the way she held space for the silence, in the fact that she didn't try to fix him or minimize what he'd experienced. By the end of the session, he was stable enough to go home. By the next week, he was enrolled in a peer support program. By the next month, he was training to be a crisis counselor himself, which meant Elena's impact had just multiplied. This was the work. Not titles or vindication or watching the person who'd destroyed your career sell insurance from a folding table. The work was taking 17 soldiers' worth of pain and transmuting it into 17 soldiers' worth of hope given to someone else. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It always had been. The restraint of a person who knew exactly how much damage she could do and chose, every single morning, not to do it. She chose to heal instead. She chose to build instead of burn. She chose to give second chances to people like the Major who'd recognized her, like Clayton the Marine who'd saved evidence, like Graves the SEAL leader who'd flown across the country because someone had recognized his training and activated a network of protection. That was the real military. Not the medals or the ranks or the official ceremonies. It was the quiet code that said, we take care of our own, and we take care of the people they tell us about, and we build systems strong enough that no single person with authority can break them again. Elena stood up. Her shift was starting. The scrubs she put on didn't feel like a uniform anymore, though they were. They felt like armor and permission and purpose all at once. As she walked through the hallway toward the patient rooms, a young nurse called out, "Senior Chief. The vet in Bay 2 wants to know if you'll be the one checking his vitals." Elena nodded and kept walking. She didn't correct them. She didn't need to. Her name would handle that. "I'm coming," she said simply. And she was. Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.